Tonight's lecture is over Module 1.1, Environmental Literacy and Sustainability. Although it is not a tourist hotspot, Greenland offers some spectacular sights, such as colossal ice sheets, a lively seascape, rare and impressive wildlife such as whales, seals, polar bears, and eagles. But on his umpteenth trip to the island, Thomas McGovern was not interested in any of that. What he wanted to see was the garbage, specifically the garbage that Viking settlers had left behind some 7 centuries earlier. Who is Thomas McGovern? Well, McGovern is an archaeologist at the City University of New York. He had been on countless expeditions to Greenland over the preceding 40 years, digging through layers of peat and permafrost. He and his team had unearthed a museum's worth of artifacts that, when pieced together, were beginning to tell the story of the Greenland Vikings. But as thorough as their expeditions had been, that story was still maddeningly incomplete. Here's what they knew so far. 1,000 or so years ago, Norse settlers arrived in Greenland, possibly in search of new walrus populations to support the ivory trade. Ivory was a lucrative commodity, and walrus populations had been overhunted from the outposts in Iceland, another colony of Norway. An infamous Norse Viking by the name of Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland as a sentence for a murder conviction, supposedly led a small group of followers to a vast expanse of snow and ice that he had dubbed Greenland, a name legend says he felt would attract more settlers. Most of Greenland was not, in fact, green. It was a forbidding place, marked by harsh winds and sparse vegetation. But tucked between 2 fjords along the southwestern coast, protected from the elements by jagged, imposing cliffs, the Norse settlers found a string of verdant meadows brimming with wildflowers. They set up camp here and proceeded to build a society similar to the one they had left behind in Iceland and their ancestral home of Norway. They farmed, hunted, and raised livestock. They built barns and churches as elaborate as the ones back home. They established an economy and a legal system, traded goods with mainland Europe, and at their peak reached a population of about 3,000. And then, after 450 years of prosperity, they disappeared, leaving little more than the beautiful, tragic ruins of a handful of barns and churches in their wake. Researchers suspected that disturbances in the natural environment, for instance, a cooling climate, loss of soil, problems with the food supply, may have been the deciding factors in their disappearance. While other researchers probed ice sheets and soil deposits in search of clues, McGovern stuck to the garbage heaps, or middens as the Vikings called them. Every farmstead had one, and every generation of the farmstead's owners threw their waste into it. The result was an archaeological jackpot. Fine-grained details about what people ate, how they dressed, and the kinds of objects with which they filled their homes. It gave McGovern and his team a clear picture of how they lived. And that brings us to our key concept number 1. Environmental science draws on science and non-science disciplines to understand the natural world and our relationship to it. When I say ours, I mean human relationship to it. From a modern developed society like the United States, it can be difficult to imagine a time and place when the natural world held such sway over our fate. Our food comes from a grocery store, our water from a tap, even our air is artificially heated and cooled to our liking. These days, it seems more logical to consider societal conflict or even collapse through the lens of politics or economics. But as we see time and time again, the natural environment and how we interact with it plays a leading role in the sagas that shape human history. This is as true today as it was in the time of the Vikings. So let's first define the environment. Environment is a broad term that describes the surroundings or conditions, including living and non-living components, or biotic and abiotic components, in which any given organism exists. And that brings us to environmental science. Environmental science is a field of research that is used to understand the natural world and our relationship to it. It is extremely interdisciplinary. It relies on a range of natural sciences such as ecology, geology, chemistry, and engineering to unlock the mystery of the natural world and to look at the role and impact of humans in the world. It also draws on social sciences such as anthropology, psychology, economics, and the humanities. The humanities includes things such as art, literature, and music in order to understand the ways that humans interact with and thus impact and are impacted by the ecosystems around them. And that brings us to our infographic number 1 on page 4 of your book. Environmental science studies the natural world and how humans interact with it and impact it. We must look to the natural and social sciences as well as the humanities to help us to understand our world and effectively address environmental issues and environmental questions such as, why did the Vikings disappear from this region in Greenland, and how do humans live now in such a harsh environment? And that brings us to our key concept number 2. Empirical investigations provide information about the natural world. Applied science focuses on the practical application of scientific knowledge. Environmental science is an empirical science. It scientifically investigates the natural world through systematic observation and experimentation. The studies of Viking middens and ice cores are examples of empirical science seeking to understand Greenland and its history. Today, soil studies might be done to reveal the composition and water retention abilities of Greenland's soils. Environmental science is also an applied science. We use its findings to inform our actions and, in the best case, to bring about positive change. For example, an understanding of the suitability of soil for agriculture could help farmers make choices about which crops to plant. Early on, researchers thought that the Greenland colony's demise was largely due to the choices the settlers made. Poor land management and rigid conservatism kept them from changing their ways. But like any good scientist, McGovern and other researchers continued to follow the data. Recently, clues have begun to surface that paint a different picture. Greenland's interior is covered by ancient and vast ice sheets that stretch toward the horizon. To climate scientists, these expanses of ice are a treasure trove. As snow falls, it absorbs particles from the atmosphere. As time passes, the snow particles turn into ice, freezing in time perfect samples of the atmosphere as it existed when the snow first fell. By analyzing those ice-trapped particles, scientists can get a pretty good idea of what was happening to the climate at any given time. And that brings us to our infographic number 2 on page 5 of your book. Environmental science is used to systemically collect and analyze data to draw conclusions and use these conclusions to propose reasonable courses of action. Moving on, a team of scientists drilled from the surface of the ice all the way down to the bedrock below and extracted a 10,000-foot-long cylinder of ice. Analysis of thin, sequential segments of the ice core showed that when the Vikings first arrived in Greenland, the temperature had been higher than the average over the preceding 1,000 years. By the time the Vikings had vanished, temperatures had lowered so much that scientists call the period a Little Ice Age, a time when all the seasons were cooler than normal and winters were exceptionally cold. In addition, analyses of mud cores taken from lake beds around the Viking settlements, that is, samples that contain large amounts of soil that was blown into the lakes during Viking times, indicate that soil erosion had become a significant problem long before the region descended into the mini ice age. Some scientists believe that this was not a climate problem, but this was a self-inflicted problem. It happened the same way that soil erosion happens today. They overgrazed the land, and once it was denuded, there was nothing to anchor the soil in place, so the wind carried it away. Overgrazing wasn't their only mistake. The Greenland Vikings also used 6-foot thick slabs of grassland sod to insulate their houses. A typical home took about 10 acres of grassland to insulate. On top of that, they chopped down the birch forests, harvesting timber to provide fuel and to build houses. Greenland's ecosystem was far too fragile to endure such pressures. The short, cool growing season meant that plants developed slowly, which in turn meant that the land could not recover quickly enough from the various assaults to protect the soil. The Greenland settlers responded by changing some of their ways to better fit their new and, as it turns out, changing environment. They irrigated fields and fertilized with manure. They depended less on livestock for food, whose numbers were dropping, and more on seals. But this wasn't easy. Hunting these animals was dangerous and required teamwork. All members of the community worked together to support these seal hunts, harvesting enough food to get them through the hard winters. But it turns out the path that they chose was only useful in the short term and may have prevented them from adapting further when things got even harder. And that brings us to key concept number 3. Environmental problems are difficult to solve because there are multiple causes and consequences. Different stakeholders prefer different solutions, and potential solutions come with trade-offs. So the ability to understand environmental problems is referred to as environmental literacy. Such literacy is crucial to helping us become better stewards of the earth. This is especially important because many environmental problems are multifaceted and hard to solve. Scientists refer to them as quote-unquote wicked problems. Wicked problems can be extremely complex because they tend to have multiple causes, each one difficult to address. And there are also multiple consequences requiring that we fight a battle against the wicked problems on several fronts. Things are further complicated by the fact that different groups of people affected by the issue, we call those stakeholders, may prefer different solutions. For example, a citizen of a landlocked state or nation may feel that the sea level rise expected with climate change is a minor problem, whereas a coastal resident may feel threatened by the sea level rise already occurring. These two individuals might differ in what they feel is a reasonable response to climate change. Here's the caveat. That problem that I just outlined for you was worded in a way to just assume that climate change causes sea levels to rise. Do we really know that? You have to be very careful with the way things are worded. All climate change does is imply that the environment is constantly changing, which it is. Moving on, water and air pollution, the loss of biodiversity, climate change, and how to feed an ever-growing world, these are all crucial wicked problems that must be addressed. But because of their complexity, any given response to an environmental problem involves significant trade-offs. No single response is likely to present the ultimate solution, and each potential solution may create new problems that must be solved. In addition, when confronting wicked problems, we must consider not only their environmental, but also their economic and social causes and consequences. Scientists refer to this trifecta as the triple bottom line. Solutions must be good for the environment, good for society, and affordable. And this brings us to our infographic number 3 on page 7 of your book. Wicked problems are difficult to address because they have many causes and many consequences, and in many cases, each stakeholder hopes for a different solution. Solutions that address wicked problems usually involve trade-offs, so there is no clear quote-unquote winner. One example of a wicked problem is climate change. Many causes exist for the current climate change we are experiencing. There are multiple consequences of climate change. These effects will be varied for different species and people depending on where they live and their ability to adapt to the changes. While there are many solutions that can help address climate change, each brings new problems that must also be addressed. Again, I would like to point out to the class that climate change is such a polarizing word and concept. I think what we need to take home, one thing that we know for certain, just through looking at ice cores, is that the Earth's climate has been in a constant state of flux. It's constantly changing. To that end, can we certainly say with conviction that the progress of humanity is a direct contributor to that? And do we really need to change our lifestyle? It's hard for us humans with our relatively short lifespans to really be able to conceptualize geological time and the changes that have occurred over geological time. Remember, sampling ice cores tells us quite a bit of information, but do we really know for sure? To me, it's just a hypothesis. We weren't there. No one alive was there. After all, global temperature record keeping is said to have begun around 1880 when temperatures began to be recorded in enough places to get an accurate reading of global temperatures. This gives us almost 150 years of surface temperature data, and this is something we certainly do not have for the stratosphere or for the ocean floor. Yes, ice cores, mud cores, they can give us nice hypotheses. But at the end of the day, they are just hypotheses, and be very careful of who is feeding you your data. If they have some sort of economic or political interest, they could be trying to sway you one way or another. Therefore, scientific literacy is really a must when we're looking at environmental issues. And that brings us to our key concept number 4. Living sustainably means living within the means of one's environment in a way that does not diminish the environment's ability to support life in the future. Back in his Manhattan lab, McGovern sorts through hundreds of animal bones collected from various Greenland middens. By examining the bones from different layers, McGovern can tell what the people ate and how their diets changed over time. The bones of cattle, sheep, and goats are present, as well as the remains of local wildlife such as caribou. The bones of seal and walrus are also present. As time went on, seal became an increasingly important part of the Greenlanders' diet. Conspicuously absent, McGovern says, are fish of any kind. If we look at a comparable pile of bones from the Norse settlers of the same time period from Iceland, we see something very different. McGovern explains we have fish bones and bird bones and little fragments of whale bones. Most of it, in fact, is fish, including quite a bit of cod. It appears that the Greenland settlers had moved away from fishing and focused almost exclusively on hunting walrus and seal. Walrus were hunted primarily for ivory, the main quote-unquote currency with which the Greenland Vikings traded with Europe. And seal could provide a larder of food that would last throughout the winter. However, this choice might have put Greenland colony on a path to decline and eventual extermination. Some of the most telling clues to the mystery of the Greenland Vikings' demise come not from the Viking colonies, but from another group of people who live nearby, the Inuit, or the Eskimos. Living in harsh northern climates has never been easy. The inhabitants of any region must learn how to, quote-unquote, live in place. Learn to access and use available resources, and to do so with the means of the environment. Sociologists call this traditional ecological knowledge. The Inuit had inhabited Arctic regions such as this for millennia, building over generations a fine-tuned understanding of their environment and the animals on which they depended. They learned the seasonal cycles and exploited resources during seasons of plenty. The Inuit were expert hunters of ringed seal. They knew where and when and how to capture this difficult-to-catch but very abundant food source. They also knew how to heat and light their homes with seal blubber instead of firewood. The Vikings might have survived the Little Ice Age if they had learned from the Inuit, their neighbors. The Inuit had lived in the Arctic regions for millennia, much like the Vikings, but their customs were better matched to Greenland's environment. Excavations show very few Inuit artifacts made their way into Viking settlements. The book goes on to make the point that the Norse had disdain for the Eskimos. What the book does not say is that there is evidence that the Inuit attacked the Norse settlers. Therefore, it's likely that the Eskimos also had disdain for the Vikings. Furthermore, your book does not disclose the number of Norse artifacts that may have been found in the Inuit settlements. Social stigmatisms on the Inuit side may have prevented the Norse from making any meaningful contact or sharing of information with the Inuit. The fact is, even with McGovern's research, no one really knows what happened there. The Norse colonists of Greenland and Iceland brought their own tradition of ecological knowledge honed over a millennia in Norway to their new homes in Greenland. This didn't always apply to their new environment, though. At some point in time, settlers in both Greenland and Iceland realized how profoundly different their new lands were from Norway. Growing seasons were shorter, thin soils were much more fragile, and because the land could not rebound quickly, rearing cattle was very unsustainable. Moving on, once they saw that their old ways would not work in their new environment, the Icelandic Vikings made changes. They not only switched from beef to fish and favored some hardier goat over sheep, but also began conserving their wood and abandoned the highlands where soil was especially fragile. As a result of these and other adaptations, they survived and prospered. The Icelanders responded to the limitations of their natural environment in a way that allowed them to meet present needs without compromising the ability of future generations to do the same, an approach known today as sustainable development. The United Nations advocates sustainable development and offers guidance to achieve sustainability worldwide. In 2015, the UN published its 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, presenting 17 goals that seek to protect the planet and ensure health and prosperity for all people. The goals focus on human concerns and environmental issues. Again, class, be very careful of this. The United Nations is a political organization, and it also has economic interests. But let's get back to our Viking story. Like their Icelandic kinfolk, the Greenland settlers made changes. They abandoned the highlands and moved further up the fjords to the most protected areas they could find. They reduced their livestock herds and tried to improve grassland productivity by fertilizing pastures with animal manure, an action that worked in Norway, but in Greenland just made matters worse. The manure trapped water. This kept the ground frozen longer, essentially shortening the already short growing season. As farm productivity declined, the Greenlanders depended more and more on seal for food, an enterprise made less efficient by their move further from the open ocean. These dangerous hunts required most of the men and boats in the settlement for a large part of the summer. One bad storm or attack by a hostile Inuit could seriously deplete the number of able-bodied men in the settlement, and time saw their numbers slowly erode. At a time when the Little Ice Age was making life exceedingly difficult and agriculture all but impossible, the Greenlanders may have become so specialized as walrus and seal hunters that they lacked the skills or equipment needed to pursue fishing on a large scale as their Icelandic kinfolk did, or to adopt the more appropriate and less dangerous Inuit hunting methods. Changing course may have proved impossible at that point. Adding to their plight, they soon found themselves increasingly isolated. Europe was dealing with the Little Ice Age too and found little incentive to attempt the dangerous journey to Greenland, a colony now with little to offer in needed trade goods. As time wore on, ships that had visited every year came less and less often. After a while, they did not come at all. For the Greenland Vikings, who depended on the Europeans for iron, timber, and other essential supplies, this loss proved devastating. And this brings us to infographic number 4 on page 9 of your book. This details the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And that brings us to key concept number 5. Human impact on Earth may be so great that we may be ushering in a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. These impacts may be approaching or in some cases exceeding the boundaries that delineate safe operating zones for some of the physical and biological processes that allow Earth to support life as we know it. When it comes to the environment, modern societies are not as different from the Vikings as one might assume. The Vikings initially tried to use farming methods that were ill-suited to Greenland's climate and natural environment. We, too, use farming practices that strip away topsoil and diminish the land's fertility. We have over-harvested our forests, and in doing so, have triggered a cascade of environmental consequences, like the loss of vital habitat and biodiversity, soil erosion, and water pollution. We have overfished and overhunted and have allowed invasive species to devastate ecosystems. And whereas the Greenlanders showed signs of trying to adjust their environment amidst changes, we seem less inclined to do so as these environmental assaults continue. The Icelandic Vikings learned to live in their new home, adjusting their way of life and society to meet the challenges they faced. What about modern humans? Do we have the ecological knowledge needed to live sustainably? Many of our own problems stem from a disconnect in our understanding of the relationship between our actions and their environmental consequences. For example, many people in the United States don't realize that entire mountains are being leveled to produce their electricity, destroying thousands of acres of habitat and polluting the air and water of local residents. This is being done to access coal in the Appalachian Mountains. Likewise, we are often ignorant of the connection between the burning of that coal and mercury-contaminated fish or increased asthma rates. We also face a suite of new problems that did not trouble the Vikings. A global population poised to top 11 billion by 2100 will strain Earth's resources like never before. Air and water pollution threaten all species, and climate change, caused largely by the use of our greenhouse gas-emitting fossil fuels, endangers ecosystems and human communities worldwide. Moving on, in fact, the impact of humans on Earth is so great that in the year 2000, some scientists hypothesized and proposed that we have entered a new geological time interval, suggesting the name Anthropocene. which means the age of humans. They argued that distinctive geological evidence of our existence is accumulating and will be left behind long after we are gone. Evidence such as the global distribution of radioactive elements from nuclear weapons or the profusion of plastic pollution. According to the current geological timescale, we are presently in the Holocene epoch, which began at the end of the last ice age, almost 12,000 years ago. But in 2019, a panel of scientists commissioned to examine the evidence formally endorsed the Anthropocene as a new epoch designation to the International Union of Geological Sciences. The group will move forward to identify the defining geologic marker present in Earth's rock layers that will designate the transition from the Holocene to the Anthropocene epoch. This transition to a new epoch has significance, not so much for which marker is chosen to mark the changeover, but for what it might mean for our future. For all of human history, humanity has enjoyed the relatively stable planetary conditions and climate of the Holocene epoch. Some scientists of the Stockholm University Resilience Center argue that human actions are so altering Earth's environment on a global scale that they threaten the stability of the Earth systems that we and other species depend on and are adapted to. In 2009, these scientists proposed a new approach to evaluate how human actions were affecting the ability of the planet to sustainably support humanity. This is called the Planetary Boundaries Framework. The Planetary Boundaries Framework quantitatively identifies quote-unquote safe operating zones for 9 important Earth systems or processes on which we depend. When our actions take us past the boundaries that delineate those safe zones, we enter a zone of uncertainty that represents the increasing risk of unacceptable environmental change. Beyond that, we enter high-risk territory where tipping points might be surpassed from which the ecosystems and Earth processes on which we depend cannot recover. In 2015, evaluation suggests we have surpassed the safe operating zone for 4 of the planetary boundaries. For 2 of them, we are already in high-risk territory, and climate change is, and will continue to be, one of the leading threats to sustainability impacting many of the vital Earth systems on which we depend. Planetary boundaries research is beginning to influence sustainable development policy, but we should stress that the focus for sustainability policy should be on staying within the safe operating boundaries and not pushing up against the boundaries. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is a UN report that evaluates environmental problems and makes recommendations about addressing those problems, concludes that human actions are straining the ability of the planet's ecosystem to sustain further generations. But there is hope. If we act now, the report's authors also write that we can reverse much of the damage. Some of the best lessons about how we can do this come from the natural environment itself. Again, class, I'd like to emphasize here that the Earth's climate has been changing since the dawn of time. And while these reports and this committee or group with the Planetary Boundaries Framework may be doing some really wonderful work, and they may have some great insights, but I ask you to independently follow the money. Who's funding them? What's their end game? And as always, be constantly skeptical. And that brings us to our infographic 5A on page 11. Human impact increased dramatically after the Industrial Revolution and again after World War II. The second surge in resource use and pollution generation, dubbed the Great Acceleration, marks the beginning of a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. Research is already underway to determine which geologic marker will serve as the definitive physical evidence that separates the Holocene, which is our current epoch designation, from this new geologic time period. And that brings us to our infographic 5B, which is on page 12. Based on the assumption that the conditions of the relatively stable Holocene epoch represent the only planetary state that we know can support modern human society, researchers have developed the planetary boundaries framework to identify levels of human impact that keep us within the safe operating zone for vital Earth processes. Values outside the quantitatively determined boundaries put us in a zone of uncertainty as to whether the Earth's systems can recover from damage or continue to operate at needed levels. Beyond this zone of uncertainty, we face a greater possibility of unacceptable and irreversible environmental change that puts our own well-being, indeed every human society as we know it, in jeopardy. And that brings us to key concept number 6. Natural ecosystems are sustainable because of the way they acquire energy, use matter, control population sizes, and depend on local biodiversity to meet their needs. So compared to their counterparts in Greenland, the Icelandic Vikings were more successful at responding to their environment as they adopted more sustainable practices. They didn't have to look far for a model of sustainability. Natural ecosystems are sustainable. This means that they use resources, namely energy and matter, in a way that ensures that those resources continue to be available. To survive, organisms need a constant and dependable source of energy, but as energy passes from one part of the ecosystem to the next, the usable amount of energy declines. Therefore, new inputs of energy are always needed. A sustainable ecosystem is one that relies on renewable energy, that is, energy that comes from an infinitely available or easily replenished source. In fact, replenishable energy may be a better descriptor since energy, once it is used by living things, cannot be renewed and used again. Please reference the laws of thermodynamics. For the vast majority of ecosystems on Earth, that energy source is the sun. Photosynthetic organisms such as plants trap solar energy and convert it to a form that they can readily use or that can be passed up the food chain to other organisms. Unlike energy, matter, that is, anything that has mass and takes up space, can be recycled and reused indefinitely. The key is not using it faster than it is recycled. Sustainable ecosystems recycle matter so that the waste from one organism ultimately becomes a resource for another. It is also important to keep populations in check so that resources are not overused and there is enough food, water, and shelter for all. In sustainable ecosystems, predators, competitors for resources, and disease all provide population control. Finally, sustainable ecosystems depend on local biodiversity to perform many of the jobs just mentioned. Different species aid in population control. Others have different ways of trapping and using energy and matter that boost productivity and efficiency. Higher biodiversity, that is, the greater number of species and more variation between individuals within a species, generally means more energy can be captured, more matter can be recycled at a faster pace, and population sizes can be better controlled. And that brings us to our infographic number 6, which is on page 13 of your textbook. Here we see ecosystems found on Earth today have the capacity to be naturally sustainable. They all share characteristics that allow the capture of energy and use of matter in a way that allows them to persist over time, all without degrading the environment. And that brings us to key concept number 7. Human societies can become more sustainable by mimicking the way natural ecosystems operate. Human ecosystems are another story. Humans tend to rely on non-renewable resources, those whose supply is finite or is not replenished in a timely fashion. The most obvious example of this is our reliance on fossil fuels such as coal, natural gas, and oil to power our society. Well, the term non-renewable resource is sort of a red herring in itself when we're applying it to fossil fuels. For instance, fossil fuels can be replenished, but it takes a very vast geological time period. So essentially non-renewable to our short lives. This renewal cycle of fossil fuels moves far too slowly to keep pace with our rampant consumption of them. On top of that, we have a hard time keeping our population size under control despite, or maybe because of, all of the advances of modern technology. We generate volumes of wastewater, much of it toxic, and have yet to fully master the art of recycling. Our actions are decreasing biodiversity at an alarming rate. Furthermore, humans depend on just a few energy sources and 3 crops. Rice, wheat, and corn predominate in our agricultural systems. Increasingly, however, we humans are looking to nature to help us learn to change our ways. By studying and emulating nature, we learn what is reasonable to do and how to do it. Scientists are applying this knowledge for all kinds of things. For example, to design better products, to find more sustainable methods of growing crops, and to trap and use sustainable energy. Despite such efforts, some concerned scientists and environmentalists say that modern global societies are now acting nearly as quickly as they could or should. What prevents us from changing our ways, even in the face of brewing calamity? Religion, money, power, those are all things that keep people from changing. Maybe we're not only witnessing the transition from the Holocene to the Anthropocene right before our very eyes, but maybe we're also witnessing another point of human evolution, where people are evolving into some sort of cybernetic organism, changing the way that we think and perceive of life altogether. I mean, everything with computers and robotics and artificial intelligence, I don't think it's that far-fetched. Why were humans given the capacity to be able to think and to reason mechanically and to develop these technological advancements that require things like fossil fuels? And why is it so difficult to think outside of that box? Why can't we invent something that would replace fossil fuels? It is hard for us to fathom geological time. So think about this. Our lives are very short, relatively speaking, a blink of an eye in geological time, right? So follow me here. Maybe what we're seeing with the use of fossil fuels and the need, call it a need, a want to have that kind of an energy, as your book puts it, non-renewable, even though over a long period of time it is. Did you ever think that what we're seeing is some sort of type of reincarnation or some long, drawn-out geologic cycle? Fossil fuels got their start a long, long time ago while dinosaurs were still roaming the earth. It's hypothesized that 65% of dinosaurs that we know of were herbivores. In other words, they got their energy from eating plant material. Coal derived from leafy green plants and petroleum products such as oil and natural gas come from the plankton that roamed the sea back during the dinosaurs era. The dinosaurs died out, and over a long period of geologic time, these plankton and leafy green plants were converted into the fossil fuels that we use today. We extract these energy sources and we use them to power our homes and our cars and industry in general. How does this relate? I always say that life is like a wheel. Well, to understand this concept I'm trying to outline to you, we need to jump ahead to Chapter 2. Let's turn to page 52 and look at the infographic there on the carbon cycle. For that matter, I could also direct you to your basic biology book to the chapter on mitosis. But we'll stick to our environmental book today. My point here is that life is cyclical, and with the human's capacity for reasoning and logic, invention, etc., it's natural for that species to be instinctively facilitating a larger geologic cycle. And the use of fossil fuels may be just that. Let's reference back to key concept 3. Environmental problems are difficult to solve because there are multiple causes and consequences. Different stakeholders prefer different solutions, and potential solutions come with trade-offs. The use of fossil fuels may be as simple as loosh harvesting. Well, it's a hypothesis, and it's a trade-off. And it fits into the laws of thermodynamics. There are still many things that we don't understand about life and the environment. To that end, the overall use of fossil fuels may have implications that we can't see or understand. Let's move on to key concept number 8. Impediments to solving environmental problems include short-term thinking and social traps. So decisions by individuals or groups that seem good at the time and produce a short-term benefit but hurt society in the long run are called social traps. The tragedy of commons is a social trap that often emerges when many people are using a commonly held resource such as water or public land. Each person will act in a way to maximize his or her own benefit, but as everyone does this, the resource becomes overused or damaged. Herders might put more animals on a common pasture because they are driven by the idea that if I don't use it, someone else will. We do the same thing today as we overharvest forests and oceans, and we release toxins into the air and water. Other social traps emerge when beneficial actions set into motion events that build over time and create problems later. An example is using a pesticide to kill pests. Initially, the pest population is reduced and crop productivity increases, but over time, the individuals that survive the pesticide can give rise to a pest population that is resistant to the pesticide. The pest population can even grow bigger if competing or predatory organisms are also killed by the pesticide. What started out as a beneficial action, reducing a pest population with pesticides, actually made the problem worse later on. Addressing social traps requires a consideration of the long-term effects of our actions. In some cases, education about the consequences of our actions may help, but only if there is cooperation among all users. If the resource can be privatized, that is, sold to users so that they have ownership of the resource, the owners may be more likely to protect that resource and use it wisely. If a resource cannot be owned, for example, the oceans, the atmosphere, then regulation, that is, binding laws that dictate how it can be used, may be needed to sustainably manage the resource. Environmental literacy, that is, an understanding of how ecosystems operate and how our actions impact society and the environment, is our best hope for avoiding such traps. When people are aware of the consequences of their decisions, they can make better choices. Addressing social traps might include policies or regulation or education about the issue, but any actions should consider long-term costs and benefits, not just short-term ones. For example, Flint, Michigan is experiencing a serious problem of lead in the drinking water. The health problems this is causing are the result of the decision to save money by not investing in appropriate water infrastructure. Short-term gains were favored, and now the people of Flint are faced with the long-term consequences of that decision. I was watching a hearing on C-SPAN concerning climate change, when the senator asked the environmentalists to put a dollar amount on the cost of the United States going carbon neutral by the year 2050, they couldn't do it. They couldn't answer the question directly. Finally, one person on the panel of experts said that it would cost us our country. How do you do something if you can't afford to do it? Even if it's for the greater good. Is it a social trap to say that since I can't afford to do something, I'm not going to do it and therefore suffer the consequences at a later time? Or pass the consequences off to the next generation? Let them deal with it? Do you think it's the goal of all other countries like China to become carbon neutral by 2050? Why should we do so when other countries probably won't do so? What social issues was Flint, Michigan facing that prevented them from maintaining their water infrastructure? And that brings us to our infographic on page 16, The Tragedy of the Commons. This is part 1 of it. Social traps, such as the tragedy of the commons, are decisions that seem good at the time and produce short-term benefit, but that hurt society in the long run. The tragedy of the commons can occur when resources aren't quote-unquote owned by anyone. In other words, they are commonly held. Individuals who try to maximize their own benefit can end up harming the resource itself. And this is illustrated with the example of a common pasture in this slide. And in part 2 of infographic 8 on page 16, we see that addressing social traps requires long-term thinking, and here are 3 approaches that can possibly be used to help sustain the environment. Education, privatization, and regulation. And that brings us to our key concept number 9. Our worldview reflects how we value the natural world and influences the ethical choices we make regarding the environment. So conflicting worldviews present another challenge to sustainable living. Because our worldviews, that is, the window through which we view our world and existence, are influenced by cultural, religious, and personal experiences, they vary across countries and geographic regions. Even within a society, they can vary. People's worldviews determine the environmental ethic, or how they interact with their natural environment and respond to environmental problems. When people or groups with different worldviews approach environmental problems, they often draw different conclusions about how best to proceed. So let's first talk about the Vikings. The Vikings, in our example earlier in the chapter, had an Anthropocenic worldview. In other words, this is a view where humans' lives and interests are the most important. They may have viewed other species as having instrumental value, like the species were valued only for their benefit to humans. Forests were a source of timber, grasslands a source of home insulation, and a feeding ground for cattle. Moving on to the biocentric worldview, in this view, all life is valued. From a biocentric standpoint, every organism has an inherent right to exist regardless of its benefit or harm. To humans, each organism has an intrinsic value. This worldview would lead us to be mindful of our choices and avoid actions that indiscriminately harm other organisms or put entire species in danger of extinction. And that brings us to the ecocentric worldview. In the ecocentric worldview, this places value on the ecosystem as an intact whole, including all of the ecosystem's organisms and the non-living processes that occur within the ecosystem. Considering the same forests and grasslands from an ecocentric worldview, the Vikings might have decided to protect both, not only to harvest the resources they could, but also to protect the complex processes that could produce those resources only when they remained intact. And here we see infographic number 9 from page 18 of your book. But back in Greenland, in the silt-covered ruins of a Viking farmhouse dating back several centuries, archaeologists found the bones of a hunting dog and a newborn calf. The knife marks covering both indicate that the animals were butchered and eaten. It shows how desperate they were, says McGovern. They would not have eaten a baby calf or a hunting dog unless they were starving. The loss of the Norse settlement on Greenland had once been seen as a failure of the community to adapt to their surroundings, a collapse caused by unfortunate circumstances and bad choices. However, McGovern's research now suggests it was more of a decline which came about due to an inability of the Norse community to, quote-unquote, anticipate an unknowable future. Although they had some success adapting to their new surroundings and to changes that came their way in the first few centuries of their settlement of Greenland, an admirable feat considering the harsh conditions of their environment, in the end, they may have become too specialized to adapt further. Most of their time, energy, and technology devoted to seal hunts and too isolated to survive. Throughout human history, societies have come and gone. For some, their environments had changed for the worse, sometimes at their own hands contributing to their disappearance. The initial evidence that suggested that Greenland colony vanished due to poor choices, self-inflicted environmental change, and failure to adjust to a changing environment made a tidy, cautionary tale about how we should avoid making the same mistakes and seek to live sustainably. But the reality, the Greenlanders did try to make changes and live within the means of their environment, but failed. This is a more sobering reminder that even if we try to adapt and adjust to a changing environment, there are no guarantees. This suggests we should not take our environment for granted or degrade it in ways that diminish its ability to support us. To do this, we must understand our environment, how it works, and how our actions affect it. We cannot assume there will always be a time, quote-unquote, later to change our ways. Our own story is being written now in much the same way, but hopefully we will still have enough time to shape our own narrative. Will it be dug up 1,000 years hence from the ruins of what we leave behind? Or will it be passed down by the voices of our successors who continue to thrive after we are gone? Ultimately, the answer is up to us. And that brings us to our core message, which is humans are part of the natural world. Humans depend on a healthy, functioning planet. And humans put pressure on the planet in a variety of ways, but we can choose to live more sustainably.